Now you talk about terror. I've been terrorized all my day. All my day.
Hi, I'm Chris Hedges. Welcome to Days of Revolt. Today we're going to be discussing the slow-motion genocide that the Israeli government, with of course American support, is orchestrating against the 1.8 million Palestinians in Gaza. What life is like for them, how the configurations of repression and violence perpetrated by the Israeli state have changed, and what's happening in the world's largest open-air prison. Joining me in the studio is Laila el-Haddad. She has edited, along with Rafat el-Arir, Gaza Unsilenced, an anthology of writings that includes some of my own writings. She has spent much of her life in and out of Gaza. She has also authored Gaza Mom, Palestine Politics, Parenting, and Everything Between, along with Gaza Kitchen. Laila, assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.
Thank you for coming. I spent many years in Gaza, 7 years. I was the Middle East bureau chief for the New York Times, so it's a reality that I know intimately, as you do. And I think that for many people, while they read the statistics, they don't grasp the daily struggle and even horror that is visited upon Palestinians. And we must remember that 50% of the population in Gaza is under the age of 18. I think it's 75% is under the age of 25.
That's right.
You've lived there with your son. Mm-hmm. And the Israelis, by creating this siege, what they set up in 2007, mm-hmm. Is that correct?
Yeah, sort of an ongoing closure.
Curtail all sorts of basic items, including limiting quite consciously the caloric intake of Palestinians. The numbers of Palestinians, especially in the refugee camps like Jabalia and Khan Yunis, that depend on Islamic Charities or UN in order to eat, are staggering. As a mother with a child, what were the most difficult obstacles that you faced just in terms of sustaining your own family?
It's a great question, and those obstacles are continuously changing, but it's just, I think the thing I remember the most is the sort of how mentally oppressive life can be there. Feeling that everything about your life, the air that you breathe, the water that you drink, when or you can turn the electricity on or off, what sorts of foods are available to you, where and how you can move in and out of your own home, are all being controlled by an outside force.
Oh, and we should also mention the water, because huge swaths of Gaza, because the Israelis have drained the aquifers, you don't have potable water. You don't have water that you can drink.
Absolutely. They drain that coastal aquifer that central Gaza sits on, so that before the water gets to Gaza, it's like you were saying, depleted and full of nitrates right now. And because the aquifer was overpumped when the settlements that took up a significant portion of Gaza's landmass would fill their pools and water their lawns with.
I remember being in Khan Yunis and looking in the Khan Yunis refugee camp when the settlement was there, which was surrounded by cyclone fencing and guarded by probably Druze border guards, and there was no water to drink in the camp, and we looked through that fencing looking at the sprinkler system on the lawns, because these settlements look like, suburban Californian.
Absolutely. Yeah, and not to mention, having prided themselves in being sort of on the forefront of like organic gardening or like organic orchids and all sorts of business that, strawberries that are all very water intensive. So the result, of course, is that if you open the faucet today in Gaza City, the water is essentially saline. And something like, having spoken to the Palestinian Hydrological Society and others, 90% of the water is unfit to drink in Gaza, which means that most people have to rely on buying filtered water. And that can get very expensive when you have, large families, which many Palestinians in Gaza do. Not to mention that you require electricity to be able to operate the water pumps, right? And now there's like 12 or 13 hour rotating electricity shortages and cuts due to Israel having bombed the main power plant there in 2006, and it's still being semi-operational, and so on. So, all of this contributes to a real, like I was saying, a mental, a feeling of mental suffocation, and especially when you're trying to raise a child and knowing that there's all these, and I was mentioning earlier that your interaction now with your occupier, with your colonizer, is almost non-existent in the sense that they're invisible occupiers now,
Well,
right?
we should go back a little bit, because when I was in Gaza, I was in the Middle East from 1988 to 1995. And there you saw members of the Israeli Defense Force at checkpoints. Of course, the settlers were still in Gaza.
And sometimes in Gaza City, they would even come.
You're right.
Yeah.
And the Israeli Air Force would bomb. They were bombing, I think they bombed the police academy when I was there with F-16s. But Gaza's been reconfigured from a kind of a much more primitive form of occupation on the ground to a kind of high-tech prison.
Absolutely.
Where you have drones up 24 hours a day. You have, along the security perimeters that have been built by Israel, electronic computer-run machine guns. And of course, they're using very heavy artillery, missiles. And
then the naval blockade,
as well as the naval blockade, right?
So
you can, it's a 3-mile limit.
Right, it's something like 3 to 6, depending on how well the Palestinians are behaving.
Right, and with the withdrawal of the settlers, they really use almost indiscriminate firepower in a way that they didn't, I think. And they're also testing out all sorts of new military hardware that they attempt to sell. They're one of the largest arms dealers in the world.
Absolutely, it's Gaza's become their testing ground.
Right,
in a
the
sense.
sonic booms, I think you were there for.
Yeah, absolutely terrifying. And the amount of firepower they use and the sorts of weapons increase year after year, where it used to be that, like in the 90s or even in the beginning of the Second Intifada, the worst that we would see was like helicopter gunship fire. That was about it, And then came the F-16s, and then came, after the Israelis were evacuated, the settlers, then came the sonic booms, which they wouldn't have dared to use before.
Why don't you explain what those are?
So that's low-flying F-16 jets breaking the sound barrier intentionally, so to inflict, psychological terror on the civilian population. And it was something that I believe the Israelis used as well in Lebanon in 2006, and possibly, if I'm not mistaken, before that. And it's illegal, obviously, because you're doing it intentionally to terrorize the civilian, but that's the sole purpose of it. And you don't hear the jet coming, right, because they're breaking the sound barrier, and then before you know it, you just hear an intense explosion that the best way to describe it is like you feel like something on the inside out is exploding. Like you just get completely disoriented and start shaking, don't know where you are, you feel like the ground beneath you. And they were doing this on a regular basis in their so-called attempt to deter any Palestinian resistance from Gaza, in addition to regular artillery fire from the border. And then that, of course, progressed to an all-out assault and bombing in Cast Lead, and after that.
Well, there's been 3 major assaults. The
in
worst
the
one
past
was
5
last
years.
summer. The worst one last summer. And I think it's important to realize that these assaults seem to have 2 objectives. Obviously, the Israeli government would like to break support for Hamas. I think the opposite has happened, but that is part of the reason for this massive indiscriminate violence, the use of sophisticated attack craft, artillery, mechanized units against a population that is defenseless, that has no army, no navy, no command and control, no mechanized units, no artillery, and can fire off rockets, which I think Norman Finkelstein calls enhanced fireworks. Not that I defend the firing of those rockets indiscriminately, but to somehow compare those rockets to what is being done to the Palestinians is for those of us that have been there, kind of a joke. The other is to reduce Palestinians to a subsistence level so that daily life...
I would argue that's the real goal, I think.
It becomes such a struggle to get food.
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, what I always say is that it doesn't matter who's in power on the Palestinian side, because long before Hamas, there was Fatah, and we were hearing the same sorts of arguments from the Israeli side. There's no partner for peace, and the Palestinians only want terror, and the mothers teach their children, you know, this is something that, of course, I, as a mother, is very important to me, that they teach their children to hate, and on and on and on. So, you know, now it's Hamas, before it was Fatah. You know, in the West Bank, there's no rockets. You're still getting besieged and bombed and so on there and colonized.
But the food situation is
so
not
the food
as bad
situation,
in the West Bank.
So, right, no, it's not. But I mean, still, you're taking together the West Bank and Gaza, the poverty levels.
I mean, let's stop and just, in the West Bank, they've created mini Gazas. Bantustans that are completely surrounded.
And severed from one another.
Severed from one another, where they can, when they want to, shut everything down and essentially create mini ghettos that replicate the large ghetto of Gaza.
Exactly. And in fact, I always say Gaza was sort of the model or the pilot project for the West Bank, in the sense that before they began to build the separation barrier around the West Bank that eats up, 40% of the, essentially annexes 40% of the West Bank, they built it around Gaza. So very few people know that that started in the 1990s during the Oslo Accords, right? Sort of the so-called decade of peace, and continued, and now there's this electric fortified fence that you talked about surrounding Gaza. So anything they want to try out in the West Bank, they'll first try out in Gaza. And back to, we were speaking about the food situation, you'll notice that if you kind of study the targets that the Israelis bombed are overwhelmingly, we talked about infrastructure, institutions, and agricultural. And you see this sort of systematic attempt to destroy Gaza's productive sector, not only through the various assaults and raids against Gaza, but also through the ongoing siege and closure of Gaza. And this was, there was an article, I believe, in Time magazine, and there was an Israeli governmental official who had stated that the objectives of the blockade were no development and no prosperity, and then no humanitarian crisis, meaning like they wanted to kind of keep things in check, thus this caloric formula, like, look, we're allowing in 1,300 calories per person, so everything's fine. But then keeping things kind of always teetering on the brink of collapse, never providing them with enough, access, very importantly, because you can provide people with food, but what does that mean in terms of food sovereignty and people's access to those foods? It doesn't mean anything. So targeting that productive sector, making sure the population is never fully self-sufficient or able to be productive or in any way. Destroying factories, like after Assad, 95% of Palestinian factories were either destroyed or partially destroyed or inoperational, not allowing in, a ban on the import of parts for factories, cement, water filters, all this kind of thing. So the point isn't, let's just kill as many people as we can, right? That would be easy. No, it's actually much more sinister. Let's destroy the productive sector and their ability to thrive and prosper and become self-sufficient.
When I was in Gaza, I knew Dr. Abdelaziz Rantisi, who headed the political wing of Hamas. And as a 10 or 11-year-old boy in 1956, he was in Han Yunis when the Israelis did their 100-day occupation of Gaza. And in order to break the back of resistance, what were known as Fedayeen, rounded up boys and men of military age, lined them up against walls and killed them. Joe Sacco has documented this in his magnificent book, Footnotes in Gaza. And that experience of watching his uncles, cousins, neighbors being shot in cold blood radicalized Rantisi. And I think that's what we're seeing throughout Gaza. It's not seen from the outside, but this horrific and ongoing violence, 500 and some Palestinian children were murdered indiscriminately last summer, coupled with the humiliation, the collective humiliation. We mentioned the struggle to get food, and many people are dependent on handouts. I think up to 80% are dependent on some handouts. The fact that you don't have adequate medical supplies, and when people have medical emergencies, they're often They can't get out of Gaza to get to a hospital in Israel, and they will die at the border crossing. I was at an ambush at Netzarim with a 19-year-old kid who was killed, and when I went to visit his family, they told me that when the news came that his brother had been shot dead by the Israelis, he went missing, and they found him walking down the road with a kitchen knife going back to Netzarim to attack Israelis. And oftentimes violence that is carried out by the acts of resistance by Palestinians, whether it's from suicide bombings to rockets, fired into Israel, I think the causal factors of that are overlooked, that it's the massive industrial and sustained use of Israeli force that has brutalized a people to such an extent that violence is a very natural reaction, one that all of us would have. And I think we also have to add that when you are a young man in Gaza, you have no work, you have no money, you have no capacity because you don't have any resources to get married. You're sleeping 10 to the floor of a concrete hovel in a refugee camp. The only way that you can affirm yourself is to become a shaheed, to become a martyr. And I'd like to talk about the psychological consequences of the horrific daily repression, the humiliation, and the struggle, and what it's doing to people.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned earlier that something like 75% of Gaza's population is under the age of 25. And in addition to the ban on so many things that we mentioned before, like, certain types of foods and cement and whatever, what the youth of Gaza always emphasized to me is like, look, first and foremost, this is a siege on our freedoms. That needs to be, people need to remember that. A siege on the ability of farmers to farm, on fishermen to fish, and a categorical ban on students to study outside of Gaza. So there's actually a categorical ban on a certain category, ages of I think up to 35 or 40. Palestinian youth are forbidden from traveling outside of Gaza to study, be it in Birzeit or Jerusalem
Right.
or wherever. And that's really important to remember too. What happens, after if you are able to have the means to graduate in Gaza, then what? They just published a figure saying that now Gaza has the highest unemployment rates in the world. And you do see this spirit in youth, despite everything. Yes, of course, the natural reaction of anyone, right? If I was to poke you 10 times on the face, eventually you're going to swat me. But then again,
and imagine if you shoot my mother and father.
And imagine if I shoot your mother and father, and and we should remind people that there's 10,000 severely injured people
Right.
in Gaza, including many amputees now
Who can't
as a
receive
result.
prosthetics.
Who can't receive prosthetics, what kind of life, and
Right.
And yes, there's help and there's supportive organizations and so on. But then, yeah, what future? I mean, we have to remind people that, and you mentioned this, but Gaza is surrounded by a completely impervious border, sea, controlled by land, air. There's no way out.
Which we
to
should
seek
make
refuge.
clear that the military government of Sisi in Egypt,
yeah.
in alliance with
Absolutely,
Israel,
yeah.
because they are sworn enemies of the Muslim Brotherhood and
Yeah.
Hamas as well. Yeah.
Exactly.
They have
And so
to.
there's we hear stories of like migrant and refugees from Syria and here and there, risking the Mediterranean and going, and that's not even an option for Gaza. As dangerous as that journey is, that's not even an
Right.
option.
I
So
think-
again, as a youth, what do you do with, and again, it's that severe psychological repression. I mean, somebody the other day said to me, a close friends of theirs in Gaza that they mentor said to her, he doesn't know what to do anymore. He's lost all
Right.
hope. He feels like,
Well, when you brutalize people, they become brutal. I mean, you
Abs-
bomb
and
Cambodia.
that's the goal,
you
isn't
bomb
it?
Cambodia, and it is the goal. You
Yeah.
bomb Cambodia, you end up with Pol Pot.
Yes.
You bomb Iraq for 12 years, you end up with
Yeah.
ISIS. And if you read accounts of the Sobibor uprising
Mm-hmm.
in the death camp, when the Jews rose up and managed to get crude knives and burst into the offices of either German administrators or Nazi camp guards, I remember reading one account where a Jewish inmate starts stabbing one of the Germans who is administrating, going, "This is for my mother, this is for my father, this is for my sister." And the Palestinians are reacting the way we would react if we lived in that
And to be
situation.
honest, they're reacting very, their reaction is very subdued, I should say. We would probably react much more violently, I would think. I mean, if someone was to dispossess you of your land and, you know, completely divide you from one another as a people, you know, fragment you, colonize you, besiege you, and then on top of that, bomb you continuously, as you were saying, in a sustained manner.
And deny your children medicine.
And deny your children medicine and education and freedom, and you know, prevent you from farming and so on. How would you react? And not over the course of 1 year, but over the course of 60-some years.
Right.
So I think their reaction has been very subdued and mild, as a matter of fact. And you know, they constantly inspire, I always say, especially the youth, and how they have reacted. And you know, I especially like to focus and narrate the stories of especially the women, but also the youth, and you know, how they really struggle to survive with dignity and retain that humanity despite every attempt to deprive them of it, because that's ultimately the goal. How you keep the family unit together and sane, right?
I would say that it's
yeah.
Islam.
Yeah.
When I went into the refugee camps, it was that structure of 5 prayers a day.
Yeah.
The stricture against alcohol, tobacco, because these are substances that you begin to retreat into when you are in despair.
Yeah.
And
Absolutely,
part of my
that's true.
anger at Charlie Hebdo was that they were taunting the wretched of the earth about the one thing that gave them dignity and held them together as human beings and gave them a sense of purpose.
Sense of hope and purpose.
Hope
absolutely.
and purpose and dignity and courage and integrity. And I think that, you know, I don't know if you agree, but I think that the reason that the Palestinians have been able to react in such a humane fashion, with such dignity, and have been able to retain the ability to resist, and we should make clear that most resistance has been nonviolent, has been the fact of their faith.
Yeah. I mean, I agree. How can you endure in such a situation without faith? You know, in the absence of that, there's nothing left. If you look at the situation around you and you know, the forces that are supporting it, you would lose hope and all faith.
Well, I spent 7 years in the Middle East, and I walked away with a very deep and, you know, abiding respect for Islam.
Let's hope that beauty and that spirit endures, and, you know, not the worst elements that are sort of like you were saying in the aftermath of, you know, bombings and colonizations and wars, and then you kind of leave and.
But fundamentalism is its own animal. Fundamentalism in every religion looks the same, whether it's Christian fundamentalism,
and just
Jewish
reminding
fundamentalism,
that, right?
or Islamic fundamentalism.
Absolutely.
And fundamentalists in, you know, 1/5 of the world's population is Muslim, and fundamentalists like ISIS or Al Qaeda, you know, constitute not even, you know, 1%.
That's what, my husband constantly reminds people. It just happens to be this arc of history that we're in right now. And yeah, it's very ugly, unfortunately. But like you were saying, you have to look beyond the headlines or beneath the headlines. And
well, don't read the headlines.
Or don't read them at all. I don't, like I was saying, I don't have TV or I don't read the headlines.
I think the frustration for those of us who come out of the Middle East and come out of Gaza is that what happens is that these people are, you know, treated, you know, little better than animals by the Israeli government, little better than livestock led to slaughter, with, of course, complete American complicity. I remember F-16s bombing Gaza and going to bomb sites and picking up pieces of shrapnel that say made in Dayton, Ohio.
And then you see a sign said, funded by, this reconstruction is funded by the American people right next to it.
Right, there you go. People see the explosion. People see the rage.
Absolutely,
but they don't see the long, steady, slow drip of humiliation, collective punishment, violence, frustration, and so what happens is that because all of that is ignored by the outside world and by the media, it's only when something explodes, and then because there's no understanding of what led to that rage.
Absolutely, the context.
They're
and what,
certified as kind of insane.
Well, they're crazy. I mean,
right.
Look how they, you know, react. Though they're so violent, and everything becomes sort of, you know, conflated. Well, it's the religion is so violent, or whatever, and you know, and this is something too that the Israelis use in their attacks against Palestine. Well, it's you know,
it's called racism.
Yeah, there you go.
Thank you, Laila.
It was my pleasure. Thank you, Chris.
And thank you for joining Days of Revolt.
Had to eat out the watermelon patch. And you know they put me in a shack. Stole my name.